Welcome back. As we said, we have some breaking news. Last month, we here at NBC News reported that security officials had rejected Jared Kushner's security clearance, but were overruled. Well, the New York Times is now reporting, citing 4 people briefed on the matter, that they were overruled by the president, who ordered his chief of staff to have his son-in-law's clearance granted here. What's interesting is that apparently both John Kelly, the then chief of staff, and Don McGahn, the then White House counsel, he basically wrote that they supported the decision not to give him this top security clearance. Sahil, this feels like a story of, I think we always knew the president has the power to grant security clearance to anybody. We assumed that eventually if Jared couldn't get his security clearance, that the president was going to give it to him. Now we have the receipts.
Yeah, I think the president just made the decision without thinking about the institutional processes that people typically go through. He doesn't think like that. He doesn't generally look at those and view those as an obstacle when he has the power to do something. But it sounds like whoever leaked this may be speaking to the history books here, making clear who was responsible and who wasn't.
That's what it feels like here. It's like Don McGahn, John Kelly, 2 people not there anymore, you know, who throughout this whole time, I mean, Don McGahn clearly never was comfortable with the mixing of the personal and the professional in the White House counsel's office. He is always trying to create a professional White House counsel's office.
So I will say, having worked in the White House for a very long time under 2 different presidents, that if that happened in the White Houses that I worked in, I can't imagine the chief of staff or the White House counsel not resigning. If the intelligence agencies are not giving your son-in-law security clearance, there's a reason, and they know what that reason is. So the fact that Trump overruled them and gave it to him and they did nothing, I think that's a big problem. They might be trying to cover their butts now, but
how significant, Danny, in your mind?
So, you know, the backstory in Washington on this is that security clearances have become crazy. It takes more than a year for a lot of people to get security clearances. And so there's a sense of the environment that this process isn't working. Right. And, you know, Donald Trump's kind of a make things happen guy. You know, the system isn't working. I'm just going to cut through it. The question for me that remains with the Gahn and the Kelly memos that supposedly exist, according to the New York Times, is when is the balance in this administration going to change? And the more people decide that everything Donald Trump is doing is a liability to them, then the people who think that what he's doing is important enough that they should remain.
You just pointed it. This is the more former staffers there are from the Trump White House, the more blockbuster stories we're going to see like this.
Right, and the other question is, why did he have this much trouble getting a security clearance? I think there were numerous updates, an unusual amount of updates to the forms that you submit to put all your information in. I think there are people who've served in the White House. You will know better than me on this that say it's extremely unusual to have to update this as many times.
On his financial
was that the reason, or did they see something there that made them
to get denied a security clearance, there has to be something pretty.
But he was he was trying to get a very high level security clearance for what it's worth, not the middling one.
Which should even be more concerning.
No, I agree
that he was granted one.
Let me play devil's advocate. He's the president's son-in-law, whether he has the security clearance or not. So isn't he a vulnerability no matter what?
Well, he's a
security risk in either way.
Well, I agree with that.
Yes.
However, if you don't have a security clearance at the top secret, then you're not sitting in national security meetings.
You're not doing Middle East peace, are you?
You're not negotiating with MBS.
The same information.
Yep, absolutely.
You can't play the role that he's been playing. I mean, this is the dilemma inside the White House for sure.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.